August 1963. Outside Billings, Montana. The sky had the color of old steel, and the wind carried dust across the prairie in long, restless ribbons. From a distance, the McCall Ranch looked like every other ranch scattered across the rolling grasslands east of the Rockies. A weathered white house. A red barn that had faded almost pink under 20 years of sun. A line of cottonwood trees along a dry creek bed. A windmill turning slowly above a stock tank that was lower than it should have been for this time of year. But anyone who stepped through the front gate could see something was wrong. The cattle numbers were thin. The haystacks were smaller than they should have been. The machinery sat silent, and nailed to the front post of the gate was a yellow notice from the First Montana Agricultural Bank. Sarah McCall had not slept the night before. She stood on the porch in the gray morning light, holding a coffee cup that had long gone cold. At 44 years old, she looked older than she was. 2 years of drought and 2 years of carrying a ranch alone had carved hard lines around her eyes. Inside the house, her 11-year-old daughter Emily sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read a schoolbook. Every few minutes, she glanced through the window toward the driveway. Her 16-year-old brother Luke stood near the front door with his arms crossed. Neither child said much. They already knew what day it was. At 7:30 that morning, a black sedan appeared on the county road. Sarah saw it coming nearly a mile away. The dust trail behind it stretched across the prairie like smoke. Luke saw it too. "They're early," he said quietly. Sarah didn't answer. The car rolled through the gate and stopped beside the barn. 2 men stepped out. One wore a dark business suit despite the heat. The other wore a deputy sheriff's uniform. The bank manager's name was Richard Collins. He had visited the ranch twice before. Each visit had been worse than the last. This time he carried a folder. The deputy carried nothing. Sarah already knew which one bothered her more. The deputy removed his hat as he approached the porch. "Mrs. McCall." Sarah nodded. Neither smiled. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere beyond the barn, a cow bawled. Finally, Collins opened the folder. "Mrs. McCall, the foreclosure order has been approved." The words landed exactly as she expected. Still, hearing them out loud hurt more than she imagined. "The mortgage is currently 8 months delinquent." Sarah stared past him toward the horizon. "I know. The bank is taking possession of the property effective today." Emily lowered her head inside the house. Luke clenched his jaw. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. He had served eviction notices before. He hated every one of them. Collins continued reading. The legal language seemed endless. Property, assets, outstanding obligations, transfer of ownership. To Sarah, it sounded like someone reading the obituary of her husband. Jack McCall had built this ranch with his father. He had repaired every fence, dug every post hole, branded every calf. He had died beneath an overturned tractor in the spring of 1961. One bad accident. One moment of bad luck. Everything changed. At first, Sarah thought she could hold the ranch together until Luke was old enough to take over. Then came the drought. One dry year became 2. Feed prices climbed. Cattle prices fell. Bills piled up. Every decision became a choice between bad and worse. Sell equipment. Sell livestock. Miss payments. Borrow money. She had done all of it. And now none of it mattered. When Collins finally stopped reading, silence settled over the ranch. The deputy handed Sarah a copy of the order. She didn't take it. He placed it gently on the porch railing instead. "I'm sorry," he said. Collins glanced at him. The deputy looked away. Within 30 minutes, another truck arrived. Then another. Auction workers. Sarah watched them spread across the property. One carried a clipboard. Another carried red paint. Soon bright marks appeared everywhere. The tractor, the hay baler, the grain trailer, the feed mixer. Even Jack's old welding equipment. Every red mark felt personal. Luke couldn't watch. He walked toward the barn. Sarah followed him. Inside, sunlight filtered through cracks in the wood walls. Dust floated in golden beams. Jack's saddle still hung where he left it. Luke stared at it for a long moment. "They can't do this." His voice cracked. Sarah looked at the saddle, then at the empty stall beside it. "Yes, they can. Dad built this place." "I know. He worked his whole life for it." Sarah swallowed hard. "I know." Luke kicked a loose board across the floor. The sound echoed through the barn. For a second, he looked like a little boy again instead of a young man trying desperately to become the head of a family. "I should have quit school and worked more." Sarah turned toward him immediately. "No. I could have helped." "No. We could have saved it." Sarah grabbed his shoulder. For the first time that morning, her voice became firm. "This is not your fault." Luke looked away. The tears in his eyes embarrassed him. Sarah pretended not to notice. Outside, vehicles continued arriving. Neighbors, ranchers, curious townspeople. Word traveled fast across Montana. People came for different reasons. Some wanted bargains at the auction. Others came because they felt sorry for Sarah. A few simply wanted something to do on a Saturday. By 10 o'clock, nearly 30 people stood around the property. Nobody knew what to say. Many of them had received similar warning letters from banks. Some feared they might be next. The drought had hurt everyone. Among the arriving vehicles was a dusty pickup truck that nobody paid much attention to. It pulled up near the back fence. A tall man stepped out wearing worn boots, denim jeans, a tan canvas jacket, and a plain tan Stetson. He looked like any rancher passing through eastern Montana. No one greeted him. No one recognized him. The man closed the truck door and spent several minutes simply looking around. He examined the cattle pens. He studied the fencing. He looked toward the barn, then toward the house. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though he were trying to understand the story behind the place. Eventually, he stopped near the windmill. An older rancher standing nearby nodded politely. "Tough day." The stranger nodded. "Looks that way." The rancher spat into the dust. "Bank finally got her." The stranger watched Sarah across the yard. "How long's she been here?" "Since before the war." The stranger was silent. The rancher continued. "Husband died a couple years back." The stranger's eyes remained fixed on the house. "And the kids?" "Boy's 16, girl's 11. The stranger looked toward Luke. The boy was helping move feed sacks, despite knowing it wouldn't change anything. For a long moment, the man said nothing. Then he asked a single question. "How much does she owe?" The rancher shrugged. "More than she's got." The stranger looked toward the bank manager, toward the auction workers, toward the house, and finally back toward the prairie stretching endlessly beyond the ranch. The auction was scheduled to begin at noon. The stranger checked his watch. There were still 2 hours left, and before the day ended, everyone on that ranch would remember exactly where they stood when he decided to get involved. By noon, the sun had burned through the morning haze, but it brought no relief. The air remained dry and heavy, carrying the smell of dust, livestock, and old wood baked by years of Montana summers. More vehicles had arrived, and the crowd surrounding the ranch had nearly doubled. Men in work boots leaned against pickup trucks. Farmers stood in small groups speaking quietly. Some looked at Sarah McCall with sympathy. Others avoided looking at her altogether. Everyone understood what foreclosure meant because nearly everyone feared it. The drought had spared very few families. The auction workers moved steadily across the property, attaching numbered tags to machinery and equipment, while Richard Collins reviewed paperwork at a folding table near the barn. To him, the day was another transaction. To Sarah, it was the end of a life. She stood near the porch steps with Emily beside her and watched strangers place numbers on objects that carried memories instead of prices. Jack's welding machine received a tag. The old grain trailer received a tag. The tractor Jack had rebuilt with his own hands during the winter of 1956 received a tag. Sarah felt as if pieces of her husband were being marked for sale one by one. Luke wandered between the buildings in silence. Every so often, someone would place a hand on his shoulder or offer a few words of encouragement, but the words never lasted. There was nothing anyone could say that would stop what was coming. Near the back pasture, the stranger in the tan Stetson continued observing everything. He never inserted himself into conversations. He never introduced himself. He simply watched. He noticed the way Sarah carried herself despite the circumstances. He noticed how Luke kept trying to stay busy so nobody would see the anger in his eyes. He noticed Emily holding tightly to her mother's hand whenever another piece of equipment received a tag. Most of all, he noticed how nobody was helping. Plenty of people had gathered to witness the foreclosure. Plenty had opinions. Plenty whispered about how unfair life could be. Yet not one person stepped forward with a solution. Shortly before noon, an auctioneer climbed onto the back of a flatbed trailer and tested a microphone connected to a portable speaker. The sharp burst of feedback silenced conversations across the ranch. The crowd slowly gathered in front of him. Collins checked his watch and smiled with the satisfaction of a man whose paperwork was finally complete. The deputy sheriff stood nearby looking considerably less comfortable. He had spent most of the morning avoiding eye contact with Sarah. The stranger drifted closer to the gathering crowd but remained near the edge, hands resting casually in his jacket pockets. When the auctioneer finally spoke, his cheerful voice felt almost cruel against the mood hanging over the property. He welcomed everyone and thanked them for attending before launching into the sale. The first items were small tools and equipment, wrenches, compressors, spare parts. They sold quickly. Then came larger machinery. The bidding became more aggressive. Each time the auctioneer called for offers, hands rose from different parts of the crowd. Prices climbed, deals were made, papers changed hands. Sarah watched years of work disappear in a matter of minutes. Every successful bid felt like another nail driven into a coffin. Luke could barely stand still. Twice he started walking away before forcing himself back toward the crowd. He wanted to remember what happened. He wanted to remember every face. Emily buried her face against her mother's side whenever applause followed a completed sale. The stranger watched all of it without speaking. Nearly an hour passed before the auction reached the equipment that mattered most: the tractor, the feed mixer, the cattle trailers. Those items brought stronger bidding and larger crowds. People pushed closer. Dust swirled beneath boots. The auctioneer's voice grew louder with excitement. Collins appeared increasingly pleased. Sarah felt increasingly numb. Somewhere during the bidding, she stopped thinking about saving the ranch. That possibility had already died. Instead, she found herself wondering where she and the children would sleep in a week. The question terrified her more than losing the property itself. Then the auctioneer announced that the next portion of the sale would include the ranch house, surrounding acreage, and primary structures. Conversations stopped immediately. This was the main event. This was why many buyers had come. Several investors stepped closer. A cattle company representative removed a notepad from his pocket. Collins adjusted his tie and folded his arms confidently. The auctioneer raised his hand and called for an opening bid. Before anyone could answer, a calm voice emerged from the back of the crowd. "How much does she owe?" Heads turned. The question wasn't loud, but it carried across the gathering. The auctioneer paused. Collins frowned. The stranger stood near the rear fence, exactly where he had been moments earlier. The auctioneer looked confused. Collins answered before anyone else could. "The debt isn't part of the auction." The stranger didn't move. "How much?" Collins sighed impatiently. "Why?" A few people laughed nervously. The stranger's expression never changed. Collins finally opened his folder. $32,400. The crowd fell silent again. In 1,963, it was a tremendous amount of money. Most people present would never see that much cash at one time in their lives. Collins seemed satisfied that the answer would end the conversation. Instead, the stranger nodded slowly as though confirming a figure he had expected. Then he turned and walked toward his pickup truck. Several people exchanged confused glances. Sarah barely noticed. She assumed he had lost interest and was leaving. The auctioneer attempted to resume the sale. He called for an opening bid once more. Before anyone could answer, the stranger returned carrying a worn leather case. He walked directly through the crowd. Conversations died around him. Even the auctioneer stopped talking. The stranger reached the folding table where Collins stood reviewing documents. Without a word, he placed the leather case on the tabletop and opened it. Bundles of cash filled the interior. For a moment, nobody spoke. The wind seemed to stop. Even the livestock noises from the pasture faded into the distance. Collins stared at the money. The deputy stared at the money. The auctioneer stared at the money. Sarah stared at the money. Slowly, the stranger began removing stacks and placing them onto the table one at a time. The sound of each bundle hitting the wood seemed unnaturally loud. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The stranger counted carefully, methodically, as though conducting routine business. 20,000? 25,000? 30,000? Then more. Collins finally found his voice. "What exactly are you doing?" The stranger continued counting. "Paying her debt." A ripple moved through the crowd. People glanced at one another in disbelief. Sarah felt her knees weaken. Luke looked from the stranger to the cash and back again, struggling to understand what was happening. Collins stared at the growing pile of money. "You don't even know this woman." The stranger placed another bundle onto the table. "Maybe not." Collins swallowed. "Then why?" For the first time all afternoon, the stranger looked directly at him. "Because somebody should." The words hung in the air. No speech followed. No dramatic gesture. No grand explanation. Just a simple statement delivered with complete certainty. Around them, the entire ranch stood silent. And for the first time since the black sedan had arrived that morning, Sarah McCall felt something she had not felt in months. Hope. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The wind rolled across the prairie and rattled the loose tin on the barn roof. Somewhere behind the cattle pens, a gate creaked softly. Yet in the center of the ranch, around that folding table covered in stacks of cash, the entire world seemed frozen. Richard Collins looked down at the money as though it had appeared by magic. He checked the bundles once, then again. The deputy sheriff stepped closer and quietly removed his hat. Sarah McCall remained where she was near the porch, unable to trust what her eyes were telling her. Beside her, Emily squeezed her hand so tightly it almost hurt. Luke stared at the stranger as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, Collins cleared his throat and reached for the paperwork. His hands were no longer steady. He counted the money himself. Then he counted it again. Every dollar was there. Every cent of the debt was covered. The amount that had haunted Sarah for months sat on the table in front of him. The amount that had ended her sleep, filled her mailbox with warnings, and brought strangers onto her property was suddenly nothing more than a number that no longer mattered. Collins closed the folder slowly. For the first time all day, he seemed unsure of himself. "The debt is satisfied," he said. Nobody cheered. The moment felt too large for cheering. Instead, a quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Men removed their hats. Women wiped their eyes. The auctioneer looked down at his notes, then folded them and placed them back into his pocket. There would be no auction. The ranch house would not be sold. The barn would not be sold. The land would remain where it had always been. The future that had seemed impossible only minutes earlier had somehow returned. Collins pulled a receipt form from his folder and began writing. Every scratch of his pen seemed louder than normal. When he finished, he signed his name and handed the document to the deputy. The deputy crossed the yard and carried it to Sarah. She accepted it with both hands. Her eyes moved across the paper once, then a second time. Paid in full. The words looked unreal. She read them again. Around her, the world blurred slightly. Not because she was crying. Sarah McCall was not a woman who cried easily. It was simply the shock of watching disaster stop inches before impact. She lowered the paper and looked toward the stranger. Why? She asked quietly. The question carried farther than she intended. The stranger looked at her for a moment before answering. Your husband built something worth saving. Sarah shook her head slowly. You don't know us? No, he said. But I know men like him. The crowd listened. Nobody interrupted. I know what it costs to build something from nothing. I know what it costs to keep a family fed when times get hard. And I know there are enough people in this world willing to take. Every once in a while, somebody ought to give. Sarah lowered her eyes. For the first time all day, she felt tears threatening to break through. She fought them back. The stranger seemed to understand. He never moved closer. He never asked for gratitude. He simply stood there as though helping someone keep their ranch was the most ordinary thing in the world. Then one of the ranchers near the back of the crowd squinted toward him. A second man did the same. A woman near the pickup truck suddenly covered her mouth. Recognition spread through the gathering in waves. People began whispering, heads turned, faces changed. The realization moved through the crowd until almost everyone understood the same thing at once. The stranger in the tan Stetson was John Wayne. Yet even then he seemed uncomfortable with the attention. He reached down and closed the leather case. The deputy stepped forward. Mr. Wayne? Wayne shook his head gently. Just Wayne is fine. The deputy smiled despite himself. Nearby, Luke finally found the courage to walk forward. He stopped a few feet away. Sir? Wayne looked at him. Yes? Luke glanced toward the house, toward the barn, toward the land stretching beyond the fences. I don't know how to thank you. Wayne studied him for a moment. Then he nodded toward the pasture. Take care of the ranch. Luke swallowed hard. I will. Good. The answer was simple, direct. Exactly what Luke needed to hear. Emily approached next. She carried something in her hands, a small photograph. It showed Jack McCall standing beside a horse many years earlier. Emily held it out carefully. This is my dad. Wayne accepted the photograph and looked at it. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he handed it back. He looks like a man who worked hard. Emily nodded. He did. Wayne smiled faintly. I thought so. By late afternoon, the crowd began dispersing. Trucks pulled away from the ranch. Neighbors returned home. The auctioneer packed his equipment. Even Collins seemed eager to leave. Before getting into his sedan, he walked over to Sarah. Mrs. McCall. She looked at him. Yes? He hesitated. I'm glad this worked out. It was probably the most honest thing he had said all day. Sarah nodded politely. Collins climbed into his car and drove away. The deputy followed shortly afterward. Soon, only the family and Wayne remained near the house. The prairie had grown quiet again. Sarah walked down from the porch carrying a small cardboard box. What's this? Wayne asked. Lunch. He looked inside. Sandwiches, apples, fresh pie wrapped carefully in wax paper. Sarah smiled for the first time that day. You're not leaving my ranch hungry. Wayne laughed softly. Fair enough. They stood together in the fading afternoon light. Then Sarah reached into her apron pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. I want to pay you back. Wayne shook his head. No. Please. No. At least let me try. Wayne looked toward the horizon before answering. All right. Sarah seemed relieved. Good. He pointed toward Luke and Emily. Spend it on them. Sarah stared at him for a moment. Then she laughed through tears she could no longer hide. Wayne tipped his hat. A few minutes later, he climbed into his pickup truck. The engine started with a rough growl. Luke and Emily stood beside their mother near the porch as he pulled toward the gate. Just before leaving, Wayne stopped and leaned out the window. One more thing. Sarah waited. Wayne looked across the ranch, at the barn, at the cattle, at the house Jack had built. Don't let anybody convince you this place isn't worth fighting for. Then he drove away. The pickup rolled down the dusty county road until it became a small shape against the endless Montana plains. Sarah watched until it disappeared completely. Behind her, the ranch remained exactly where it had always been. The house still stood. The barn still stood. The fences still stretched toward the horizon. The land belonged to the McCalls again. 6 years later, in 1969, a package arrived from California. Inside were every money order Sarah had ever sent trying to repay the debt. None had been cashed. Alongside them was a short handwritten note. Only 3 sentences. Your husband earned this ranch. Your family kept it alive. Use the money for the future. Sarah kept that note for the rest of her life. Luke eventually took over the ranch. Emily became a teacher in Billings. The McCall Ranch survived droughts, storms, recessions, and changing times. Decades later, visitors would still hear the story of the day a foreclosure became a miracle. Not because a famous actor showed up, not because of the money, but because on a hot August afternoon in Montana, when everybody else stood and watched, one man decided to do something. And sometimes that is enough to change an entire family's future forever.